Hey folks, welcome back. Did they wang it? It's a series where I look at a video game, compare it to remake. You know the drill. I probably don't have to go over this every single time, right? Today we're looking at the first video game ever made, Alone in the Dark. Don't Google that, just trust me. Alright, ladies and gents, it's quiz time. What do video game genres and human beings have in common? That's right, they both have grandfathers. Now I know that seems stupidly obvious, but let's talk about it anyway for fun, huh? Every genre of game has one or a few forefathers that influenced future installments. Platform games have Sonic and Mario, RPGs have Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, whatever Pac-Man is has Pac-Man. But what about horror games? It's gotta be Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, right? Those games have been influencing game developers since you was knee-high to a grasshopper, kiddo. But if you were to think that, you'd actually be a fucking idiot. Because believe it or not, there is a game that predates all of your favorite horror games. The classic 1992 PC game, Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark is considered by many to be the first survival horror game ever made, even years before the first Resident Evil game coined the term survival horror. I've always had a fascination with this game, but I've never really played it past a few minutes in. Mostly because the release date predates the birth of Jesus Christ, making it borderline impossible to control. But you know what? Enough excuses, okay? I'm not just any gamer. I'm Idiot Ben, world-renowned SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom analyst. If I can't do it, no one can. So, ladies and gentlemen, for the first time ever, someone on YouTube is going to talk about Alone in the Dark. And again, don't look that up, okay? There's no need to ruin the illusion. Alone in the Dark was developed by French development studio Infogrames. Right off the bat, we got two big holy smokes here. First off, yes, French people are capable of doing all kinds of things other than smoking cigarettes and making house music. Shame on you for thinking otherwise. And secondly, you heard me right, the studio that made this game is called Infogrames. Not Info Games, not Infro Games. Infogrames. So I guess Alone in the Dark is the first video game ever made. Can you believe that Infogrames doesn't exist anymore? Anyway, Alone in the Dark was released in 1992 for MS-DOS, Commodore, all those good old computers that your dad showed you pictures of him using back in the day. And it also had a port on the Panasonic 3DO interactive multiplayer, and astoundingly is kind of the Super Mario Bros. Of that console, if you know what I'm saying. But for the purpose of this video, we're playing the version of the game available on Steam, which literally just runs it through DOSBox, an extremely popular emulator for playing MS-DOS games. So thanks, guys. Really makes you wonder why the f*** I bothered to pay for it. Alone in the Dark was intended as a video game experience based on the works of H.P. Lovecraft, the horror author best known for the creator of Cthulhu, and also for naming his pets racial slurs, which, again, don't Google that. Not for the same reasons as before, though. The story takes us to 1920s Louisiana, where Jeremy Hartwood, owner of a scary haunted mansion called Darsetto, has just committed suicide under suspicious circumstances. You get the choice of two characters, Emily Hartwood, Jeremy's niece, who wants to find out what happened to her uncle, or Edward Carnby, a private investigator who is sent in to find a vintage piano to sell to an antiques dealer. Unlike Resident Evil, the choice of which character you play makes no difference whatsoever. I feel bad for Emily, but we're going to be playing as Edward here because, one, I love his Pringles Man design, and two, Edward is essentially the main character of the series. He's the protagonist of most of the other games. After choosing your character, you get a pretty neat segment of either one of them describing in a voiceover why they're going to the mansion.
On my door, a dull brass plate says, Private Detective.
I mean, he's no Tom Kenny, but it's pretty cool for 1992. We then get an opening cutscene of Carnby being driven to the mansion. Edward walks in and the doors slam closed behind him, and for some reason he decides to walk all the way to the attic. I guess the piano is there, to be fair. At this point, we finally get to control our character, and if you can believe it, this fossil has pretty weird controls, so let's get into that. On paper, Alone in the Dark actually has extremely simple controls. Everything is done with the arrow keys, the space bar, and the enter key. It probably would have been better if you could click on stuff, but this game was released for MS-DOS, and a lot of people who owned home computers at that time didn't have a mouse. They operated their computer entirely through typing commands like a hacker man. But anyway, arrow keys are used to move. At this point, I would like to issue a disclaimer. The next part of the video is going to get really scary because we're going to be talking about tank controls. So maybe if you're a little baby who can't handle that, maybe you should go off and watch something a little bit easier to understand. So yeah, Alone in the Dark functions with tank controls. Up makes you go forward, down makes you go back, and left and right turn you in place. Unfortunately, Edward's walking speed doesn't exactly match up to his situation of being in a haunted mansion full of monsters, but thankfully you can run by double tapping the forward button. That said, the running isn't exactly 100%, it's more of a 60-40 kind of situation. Sometimes you gotta double tap the up key a few times in a row before Edward finally decides that he wants to run. Honestly, that's one thing I don't really feel bad about criticizing, because they could have just as easily made one of the keys on the keyboard the run button. Every other action in this game is done with the spacebar, and the way that it works is kinda weird. You go into the menu and you have a list of actions: fight, open/search, close, and push. Once you select an action, Edward is sort of set to that action, and he'll do that until you switch to a different action. So for example, if you want to push a bookcase, you go into the pause menu, select push, approach the bookcase, and hold down the spacebar until it's in the position that you want it to be. If you want to open a chest or check a shelf, you select open/search and press space near where you want to do it. Combat is a little bit more complicated. If you select fight, you hold down the spacebar to go into this hilarious fisticuff stance, and at that point you can press left or right to throw a punch, or up and down to kick. The kick has more range and does more damage than punching, but it has a long reel back animation, which often gets interrupted by monsters if they're too close. So you kind of have to strategize with which attack you want to use based on how close the monster you're fighting is. And it works the same with weapons. Melee weapons like swords have strong and weak attacks, and to use ranged weapons like guns, you hold space and press up. The controls are certainly very antiquated and weird, but if you can believe it, they're actually not super difficult to use once you get the hang of it. I mean, trust me, I'm not out here begging for more games to control like this, and I think it would be nice if they could have modded it to control better. I'm certainly not going to use any drastic words like good to describe the combat, but I've definitely played games that control worse than Alone in the Dark. So anyway, once you get into the game, you're pretty much free to explore the mansion, which is full of monsters, booby traps, puzzles, pitch black rooms, sets of armors that come to life and attack you. You know, all the good stuff you expect from a haunted mansion. Much like many of the games that would go on to take inspiration from Alone in the Dark, you also find documents throughout the mansion that explain the plot of the game, and one thing that's pretty fun is that they're all totally voice acted.
A Brightness from Afar by Lord Boleskine, an account of his celebrated voyage to New England.
Turns out that Darceto is haunted by an occultist pirate named Ezekiel... Like, come on, man, what am I supposed to do with that? Ezekiel was killed and his mansion destroyed by Union soldiers during the American Civil War. But the mansion was rebuilt and he still haunts it, using the owner of the mansion as a vessel to carry out his occult rituals. And that's why Jeremy Hartwood committed suicide. He didn't want to be possessed by the ghosts of Patchy the Pirate. So the logical main objective of the game is to break the curse by traveling underground beneath the mansion and destroying the giant tree that Ezekiel is buried under. Along the way, Edward encounters a number of terrifying monsters, such as zombies, zombie chickens, night gaunts, a vagabond, various ghosts, a giant worm monster, and a swamp monster, to name a few. It's a pretty short game, but it's got a lot of things to like. For example, my favorite puzzle where there's this room full of zombies that start coming at you, but if you put a pot of stew on the table, they all sit down to have dinner and don't bother you. Other than that, there's not a huge ton more to say about Alone in the Dark. Honestly, Alone in the Dark may be goofy and dated, but it's pretty amazingly ahead of its time when you think about it. Resident Evil may have popularized the mechanics associated with survival horror, but Alone in the Dark established them without even realizing the impact that they would go on to have. The monsters are all really strong and take a bunch of hits to kill, coupled with the fact that the combat is so clunky and your weapons are so unreliable. You're encouraged to avoid fighting monsters as much as possible. Your inventory space is limited, as are your access to resources like oil for your lamp, bullets, healing items, etc. The mansion is very non-linear and you have to use items you find to complete puzzles that allow you to advance further. The story is told through documents and secondhand accounts. The really fun thing about playing Alone in the Dark after having played Resident Evil is that you get to see the multiple ways that the former inspired the latter. In my opinion, the most fun part is the fact that in Resident Evil, if you try to open the front door, you get ambushed by zombie dogs that can't leave. I only just realized that this is actually a direct homage to Alone in the Dark, where if you try to leave out the front door, you get killed by a big green monster. You know, Alone in the Dark is a very fascinating game with a lot to love about it, but I don't think it would be fair to just sit here and pretend that it's an 100% positive experience playing this game. Don't be mistaken, controlling Alone in the Dark isn't far off from attempting to paddle a canoe with your hands while an angry mother bear quickly advances toward you. I'm sure you're all familiar with that expression. So I think it's time that we talked a little bit of shit. Get your low-hanging fruit picking shoes on. Obviously, it's important to clarify off the bat that most of the criticisms I have about Alone in the Dark come down to the fact that this game was released during the early Triassic period. That is to say, a lot of the things about this game haven't aged well, and a lot of my issues could be easily fixed by a remake. right? For starters, obviously, are the controls. Now I know, I said that they're not that bad, but that's only really once you bring yourself to put up with them. Honestly, the controls are garbage. They're clunky, unresponsive, needlessly complicated. The tank controls are actually not as bad as you might think. I mean, they're still tank controls, but moving isn't actually a huge issue in this game. It honestly feels similar to the early Resident Evil games, astoundingly enough. It was never too much of an issue for me to control Carnby. But everything else kinda sucks. The combat is not only difficult to understand, but it's also very slow and boring. Monsters take a lot of hits, and everything moves very slow in this game. Plus, if a monster starts attacking you, you don't really get much of an opportunity to fight back because the timing of their attacks is much faster than yours. Sometimes you kinda just have to take the L, load a previous save, and try again, especially if a monster has you trapped in a corner. There's also the visual aspect of this game, and don't get me wrong, Alone in the Dark is very visually stylistic. The issue is that sometimes the game uses really far back camera angles, and it can be borderline impossible to play the game. Like, I mean, look at this. He's just a bunch of pixels. What am I supposed to do here? Honestly, when it comes down to it, I can't believe that this game still exists in the state that it's in. Maybe it's more difficult than it seems, but it just kind of blows my mind that Atari hasn't even tried to make a version of this game with better controls and smoother graphics. And I mean, I get it, it's because nobody fucking cares about Alone in the Dark anymore. It doesn't have the same lasting legacy as other classic PC games like Doom and Wolfenstein do. But like, if you buy this game on Steam, it literally just installs DOSBox and runs the game off it in its original state. Like, what's the point? Why wouldn't I just install DOSBox and download this game for free? With all that said though, I love Alone in the Dark. It is true that it's aged like milk and it's a little bit more goofy than it thinks it is, but there's something about it that's so charming. The developers really clearly wanted to make something very special when making this game. It may be very silly looking, but it's actually very stylized and visually appealing in a lot of ways. The monsters are funny looking, but still believable. The vibe they give off is scary. In the end, whether or not Alone in the Dark is worth playing these days, it's an incredibly important game, and there's a whole heck of a lot to love about it. Well, there you have it, folks. The classic video game unattended in a 7-Eleven parking lot at nighttime. But those of you who are avid Did They Wang It fans will know that this is only the halfway point of the episode. We're not even close to finished. Well, I guess we're halfway finished. So let me take you back to the wacky, crazy time of the 1990s. Alone in the Dark came out for PC and actually, believe it or not, took the world by storm. It sold well and received widespread critical acclaim. But that said, the series never really managed to break into that next level of notoriety. 2 sequels were released in 1993 and 94, as well as Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare in 2001, all of which received good to great critical reception. But the series never really managed to reach the level of success that I think that the developers were hoping for. And a lot of the reasons for that had to do with the popularity and affordability of home video game consoles, and the fact that the horror genre was being carried by big Japanese studios like Capcom, Konami, and Tecmo. As a result, Alone in the Dark has kind of become one of those dead video game franchises along the lines of Conker, Onimusha, and Duke Nukem. However, there have been attempts to revive Alone in the Dark, most of which have gone about as well as Duke Nukem. I am, of course, talking about Alone in the Dark, released in 2008 for the PS3, Xbox 360, PS2, and Wii. Now, if you're familiar with this game, which you probably aren't, you're probably thinking something along the lines of, "Oh, Ben, this game isn't a remake, it's a continuation of the story, and should therefore not qualify for a Did They Wang It?" Well, for starters, I'm in charge here, okay? So I'm the only one who gets to decide what qualifies for a Did They Wang It. Not you, not Arthur, me. And secondly, I know, it's technically not a remake, but I think it qualifies as a reboot. I mean, for one thing, it's called Alone in the Dark, not Alone in the Dark 5 or Alone in the Dark Revelations or some stupid shit like that. So I think it's fair to compare it to the original. So now that I've finished defending myself from hypothetical commenters, let's just hop right in, because this game just... Let's just hop right in. Like I said, Alone in the Dark, not to be mistaken with Alone in the Dark, was released in 2008, 5 years after Infogrames was purchased by Atari and converted into Atari SE. So rest in peace, Infogrames, you didn't stand a fucking chance. So anyway, we start up the game, and right off the bat, I'm just like, what the fuck is this music? Doesn't fit the tone, fellas. Reminds me of the chanting music in Metal Gear Solid 4. Of course, it fits much better in that game. The actual game starts out, and we're in a first-person perspective, passed out on a bed while two guys argue about something. Who cares? For some reason in this segment, you have to keep manually blinking by clicking the right stick down. To be fair, it's teaching you about a mechanic of the game, but it's still awfully strange. On your way to get executed, the captor guy gets consumed by a mysterious crack in the wall. Lucky us. Then we finally get to see what our main character looks like.
My God.
Now you're probably thinking that's got to be a different character, right? There's no way that's Edward Carnby. It's Edward Carnby. So yeah, this game takes place in 2008, and not only is Edward mathematically over 100 years old, but he also looks like this now. Maybe I'm nitpicking, but what the fuck? Who is this? This isn't Edward Carnby. This looks like a knockoff Sebastian Castellanos from The Evil Within. This doesn't even look like the same person that's on the cover of the game. Like, why wouldn't you just make him... We're 5 minutes in here. I gotta conserve my energy. Edward jumps on top of an elevator and finds his buddy, Theophile Paddington. That's his real name. I'm not kidding. The bad guy's in the elevator exposition that Theo has the power to control the evil that's killing everyone through the Philosopher's Stone that he has on a pendant around his neck. Unfortunately, the elevator gets monstered, but Edward hops off. From here, our objective is to escape the building. Whoa, perilous climbing, explosions! This is one thrilling experience based off of the writing of H.P. Lovecraft. At some point, we meet Sarah Flores, an art dealer, unless you're playing the Wii or PS2 version, in which case she's a city planner. Again, I didn't make that up. After some more Uncharted, followed by some Crazy Taxi, Edward, Sarah, and Paddington make it to Central Park, because yeah, I forgot to mention, but this game takes place in New York City. Paddington gives Edward the stone, tells him to meet him at the museum, and then he checks himself out of the Hotel California, if you know what I'm saying. The way they do this is weird, because it's all dramatic and slow motion, and it plays the sad music, but like, I don't feel anything toward this guy. I literally just met him. So anyway, Carnby finds Paddington's phone and Sarah tells him to call 911, so he does, and...
Dr. Hartford here. We're relaying the Central Park emergency calls.
Hey, I'm in Central Park and I'm badly wounded.
Look, maybe I'm nitpicking, but like, that's not what happens when you call 911. They don't patch you through to a doctor. You get an operator. Like, I just, whatever. Why am I here? What am I here for? What am I adding to this? Carnby and Sarah find the doctor man who answered the phone, and he looks up Edward's medical records to reveal that, whoa, he was Edward Carnby this whole time, even though Edward Carnby mysteriously disappeared in 1938. That's longer than the average human lifespan. Anyway, Edward and Sarah pull up to the museum, and the ghost of Paddington explains that the stone is the Philosopher's Stone, and it was used to contain Lucifer to prevent him from doing bad stuff. But Crowley, this guy, he's the main antagonist, Crowley freed Lucifer, and now Lucifer wants to destroy the world, so that's not good. We gotta stop him from doing that. And that's the plot in a nutshell. I mean, there's more to it, but like, you get it. So it's that moment that you've all been waiting for. It's time that we compared the original to the remake. Or in this case, the old game to the new game, I guess. So, I mean, we all know this, but this is going to be a little different than your average Did They Wang It, because obviously, Alone in the Dark 2008 isn't a remake of the 1992 game. But you know what? I think it counts. I think it's fair to say that the game was intended as a sort of soft reboot of the series. Like, I mean, is it not fair to compare Mortal Kombat to Mortal Kombat, or Tomb Raider to Tomb Raider, or Doom to Doom? Exactly. See, it's not such a big deal. No need to get all upset about it. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. At the risk of ruining the surprise or whatever, this game fucking sucks. And it's not just brought down by bad gameplay or bad atmosphere or bad sound design or bad story. It's brought down by all of that stuff. So what do you say that we do another breakdown type thing? I'm going to compare the original Alone in the Dark to the 2008 Alone in the Dark using 3 categories: plot and atmosphere, gameplay, and most importantly, spookiness. Also, I'm going to be calling this the old game and this the new game, but not all the time. So, you know, if that's... So this first category is a little broad, mostly because I couldn't really think of one thing to categorize all the points I want to make, but you know, hey, nobody's perfect, right? So the original Alone in the Dark isn't known for its plot, okay? I'm not going to sit here and imply that the story was like a big deal, but you know what? The story is far from bad. In the 1920s, Edward Carnby, a private investigator, pulls up to a haunted mansion in Louisiana to find that the mansion is haunted. Haunted as f***, in fact. To be fair though, I'm pretty sure the entire state of Louisiana is haunted, so I don't know, might not be that big a deal. But either way, you know, it's not winning any Pulitzers anytime soon, but it gets the job done for sure. And it's also compelling enough to keep you interested, you know? The game literally only tells you the story through documents you pick up in the mansion, so it makes you want to figure out what exactly is going on here. But where Alone in the Dark really shines is the atmosphere and visuals, in my opinion. Now I know it's very silly, there are monster chickens and zombies that are satiated by a pot of human stew, but there's something about Alone in the Dark that feels so genuine. It takes itself seriously, but not to the extent that it comes off as hokey. It's like a student film, you know? They're making the absolute most out of what they have at their disposal, and it feels like a passion project. It feels like a bunch of H.P. Lovecraft book club nerds got together and said, let's make a video game. Except they said it in French. The new game, on the other hand, oh man, this game takes itself 1,000,000% seriously. It is the most generic, approved by a businessman, occult horror story imaginable. None of the characters are likable whatsoever. You got generic satanic cult leader man, creepy generic old dude who's actually a good guy, generic love interest / normal person who gets up in a crazy situation. But worst of all, you have Edward fucking Carnby. How dare you? This motherfucker is one of the least visually appealing video game protagonists I have ever seen, and he has the personality to match. Compare it to the old game and like, come on man, look at how fun this character design is. He's got a stupid green tuxedo and a big dumb goofy mustache. He's great. He doesn't even need to talk, and I get all of his personality just by looking at him. And honestly, that lack of care kind of reflects on the whole game. Everything about this game feels like it was made by a computer designed to produce generic, shitty action horror movies. There's no color, everything is dark and bland, not a single location looks different from anywhere else. The monsters are equally as boring. They're like default hellspawn monsters and weird spirit zombies and stuff. The old game pops out, man. Each room in the mansion has its own unique design, and everything is so colorful and interesting while still maintaining the aesthetic of a haunted mansion. All the monsters are goofy, of course, but they're stylized. Green zombies with their hands sticking out ahead of them, purple cube monsters, I don't know. It really sucks because one of the things that's aged poorly about the original Alone in the Dark is the visuals. They're very low res and pixelated, and it can sometimes actually affect your ability to play the game. I would love to see this game with crystal clear updated graphics, or maybe even a cartoony remake. That would be awesome. But ironically, despite the new game having significantly better graphics, it ends up looking worse than the original. But no, we can't have color and light and be able to see things. This is the 21st century. Horror has to be dark and at nighttime. Nothing scary ever happens in the daytime. The next section is going to be a doozy, so please secure your seatbelts now and hold on to your hats. The original Alone in the Dark obviously has dog shit controls. You got tank controls, the run doesn't work all the time, the combat sucks, and you have to go into the pause menu to change actions. But see, the old game came out in 1992 and was basically the first game of its time. This game came out after 16 years worth of advancements in game design. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Alone in the Dark 2008 fails on every level of gameplay. The controls are so weird and so bad in so many different ways. You have no control whatsoever over the camera, and while it doesn't use tank controls, it uses the sort of semi-tank third-person shooter kind of controls. Accessing your inventory is done through the D-pad. You press down and then go into this weird first-person view showing Carnby's jacket, and you have to switch between items from left to right. And healing works the same way too, rather than just, you know, using the healing item, you have to manually spray the stuff onto your wounds. On top of that is the combat, which is either with ranged or melee weapons, and they both work completely differently. Ranged weapons require you to switch into first-person view, which you can do on the fly, but melee is really weird. You can pick up melee weapons all over the place, like bats, pipes, chairs, etc. Wooden weapons are good because you can light them on fire, and everything in this game is permanently killed by fire. But here's where the f*** comes in. All of the melee weapons are used with the right stick. To swing back and forth, you quickly swing the stick in that direction. To do an overhead attack, you press down and then quickly snap the stick forward. It's not often that you play a game with two different methods of combat, and it's even less often that they're both bad. The game makes you switch between a third-person and a first-person perspective pretty much all the time, and it's as stupid and unnecessary as you would think it would be. Certain monsters will spit things at you, and it makes your vision all blurry, so if that happens, you have to switch into first-person and blink by clicking the right stick to clear your vision. Honestly, the more I played this game, the more I started to get suspicious of something. I don't know this for sure, but I think this game was originally intended to be a Wii exclusive, because honestly it reminds me of how you can play the Skyward Sword remake with the Pro Controller using the right stick to control the sword. That wasn't praise. That's no one should ever want to be Skyward Sword. If you don't believe me, just check this shit out. The wire puzzles make you get the wires closer together with the sticks. The first-person perspective turns the shooting into like a light gun shooter. The melee combat is very swing heavy. And speaking of the combat, you want to hear something stupid as hell? Like some really dumb shit up in here? So one of the weapons you have at your disposal are aerosol spray cans that you combine with a lighter to make a flamethrower. You know the drill. We've all been to high school. The thing is, if you run out of mosquito spray or whatever, Edward will automatically switch to a different can. And one of the cans that he often switches to is your fucking healing spray. My man burns his fucking first aid spray without so much as warning you. Like, what the fuck? Who made this game? The bad game studio? Honestly, guys, like, the bar was so low. All you had to do was make a video game that controls better than this. Than fucking this. You could have just made a stupid generic third-person horror game, but you couldn't even do that. You had to reinvent the wheel. Well, joke's on you, because the wheel you invented is square-shaped. So it doesn't even... So obviously we're down to the most important part, the spooky. And you know what, Alone in the Dark, it's not that scary. I mean, I'm sure it scared its fair share of pants off back in the 90s, but I can confirm that during my playthrough, my pants remained on. That said, it has a lot of elements that work to make the experience scarier. Limited items, weapons that break, rooms that are totally dark and require to use your lantern that has limited oil. The monsters, while not all that aesthetically scary, are very powerful and pursue you relentlessly. While it isn't as effective as it most likely once was due to improving technology, it's unmistakably a survival horror game. And then you got the new game. There is nothing scary about Alone in the Dark 2008. It is an action game with demons. None of the monsters are scary, none of the situations are scary, it's just Uncharted 5, Nathan Drake's big explosion party. 50% of this game is spent climbing buildings or out of canyons where explosions keep happening, and none of them are surprising. Like, oh boy, I certainly hope that this car doesn't explode while I'm climbing across this gap here, that would just make this situation even worse. The other 50% of the game is spent walking around dark areas solving the most fucking brain-dead puzzles and occasionally killing monsters. There's just nothing about this game that would hint at it being a survival horror game. The scenarios aren't scary. The music is loud and annoying. There are just constantly explosions and loud noises. Like, the old game may not be scary, but man, at least it tries. All things considered, it does a pretty good job, especially considering it had literally zero source material to go off of. Well, there you have it, folks. You just sat and watched a person on the internet compare two video games that really have nothing in common aside from the title. But before we go, we gotta determine one more thing, which is, of course, did they wang it? And I mean, I'm sure you know the answer, but it wouldn't be any fun if I just blurted it out, you know. Well, today's a big day for me because I can finally say that I played and compared both Alone in the Dark and Alone in the Dark. And you're not going to believe me when I say this, but game bad. Alone in the Dark 2008 not only shits all over the legacy of the classic PC game, but it also just totally and completely sucks as a game on its own. The plot is boring, the characters are generic, the gameplay is fucking atrocious, it's a horrible game. The Alone in the Dark name didn't deserve this, man. The first game was an ambitious, genre-defining work of passion. And this game doesn't even pass as like a fun by-the-books horror game, it's just plain and simple bad video game. Nobody should play it. And so I am thrilled to announce that this one has been wanged, folks. It's a bittersweet type thing, you know, because it's nice to see Wang get another point on the board. But it also makes me sad because I can't honestly think of many games that need remakes more than the original Alone in the Dark. An updated, spookier, ground-up remake with either realistic or cartoony graphics would be amazing, but for the time being, I guess we'll just have to admire the original. Wowee! Just like that, a whole episode about Alone in the Dark. A video game that nobody on the planet cares about except for me and maybe Shinji Mikami. And you know, it might not have the same impact it once did, but I'm a big fan of the original game. I think it's safe to say that without it, survival horror as we know it today wouldn't exist at all. So with another Did They Wang It under my belt, I think it's high time that you get out of my house. Bye!